in this video series, we're going to be having a look at the trope of sentient weapons and how these have been realized both in mythology and in game. All right, we'll start off our analysis with one of the most unintelligent varieties of intelligent weapons. So what we're looking at here are those kinds of weapons that reflect or embody the spirit of their owner in some fashion, almost as if the weapon and the warrior who wields it are the same thing. Now, it has been suggested by some cognitive research that humans operating familiar tools perceive those tools as being an extension of the body in some way. So it should perhaps not be so surprising that both myth and fiction are replete with such examples. So the first sword that I want to speak of is Gram, which is spoken of in the Volsunga saga. Now, in the story, it's originally driven into the great tree Barnstalk by the god Odin, and only Sigmund the Volsung is capable of drawing it from the tree. However, the blade is later used by Sigmund against a disguised Odin, where the sword is shattered and Sigmund is then killed by his enemies. Later, it's reclaimed by his son Sigurd, who has it reforged by a dwarf, and at that point renames the sword Gram, which means wrath. So he immediately uses the sword at this point to slay Fafnir the dragon. Shortly thereafter, Regan, the dwarf who forged the sword for him, and later on it goes to play a pivotal role in his whole downward spiral into violence and destruction. So obviously we've got a lot going on here, with the sword possibly standing as a symbol of Odin's favor and the vitality of the wielder, the richness of the wielder's household, and whatnot. However, I want to focus more on the sword as being reflective of his temperament and it being evocative of his intelligence and his mind. So here, the direction of influence appears to be only one way. Sigurd dictates the sword's identity and its use. So it might seem at first that the sword has no kind of latent intelligence. However, I would argue that the sword does have a form of latent, very limited intelligence, in that it's the externalization of an idea. By defining the sword as an instrument of anger and not justice or truth or peace, Sigurd sets into action a kind of a positive feedback loop in which anger begets violence, begets anger. This is the case of a person not merely having an emotion, but the emotion having the person. When Sigurd remakes Gram, he repurposes it. And at that point, Gram has a hold on him. He's defined its purpose, and then the purpose of the sword begins to define him. He has taken on an archetype at this point, and he's becoming willfully possessed by this archetype. The sword has been defined as an instrument of anger just as much as Sigurd himself. Both of them are equally instruments of a higher power. All right, so for the next example, let's consider the story of the swords of Muramasa. So the whole legend of Muramasa is a huge mess of various bits of historically attested events and complete fiction. The historical information we have is that once the Tokugawa shogunate was established, Tokugawa Ieyasu banned all swords forged by the Muramasa school, supposedly because too many of his folk had perished on these blades. Thus, the swords themselves became simultaneously reviled and prized by his allies and enemies. So much so to the point where sometimes markings on swords were ground down to obfuscate their origin. After this period, though, they featured in a lot of Japanese drama and fiction over the years, most famously with a legend that Muramasa was a student of the renowned swordsmith Masamune, Now, this definitely is a legend, as the two smiths were separated by about 150 years. But it's very interesting here because in this story, the apprentice, Muramasa, was so hell-bent on being greater than his master that this rubbed off on the swords. He forged weapons with a deadly, bloodthirsty aura. Muramasa swords could cause wielders to cut themselves merely by inspecting them. They could inspire violence when drawn, and there was something about them that demanded blood be shed before they could be sheathed. So again, we've got a great example of the sword having a nature, an inner nature, which is reflective of someone else, in this case, the person who created it. In contrast to the legend of Graham, the pride and ambition of Muramasa becomes a curse that affects not only the people in his own family, but anyone who uses his creations. However, I believe there is an underlying similarity here in that those who choose a Muramasa sword are doing so because they're walking a path similar to the sword's creator. If you're in the market for one of these weapons, it's obviously because you're willing to do whatever it takes to achieve your goals and eliminate your enemies. It's a Faustian bargain, dealing with demonic powers and being unable to bring about anything but the works of hell. Turin's sole ambition, and he becomes identified with fighting and fighting with this sword to the point where people actually start calling him Black Sword rather than his real name. But in the end, Turin is left alone and friendless, his whole family slain, and it's mostly due to his own choices and actions. Despite perceiving himself as a one-man army, his decision to wage this war is a delusion in the face of the inherent interconnectedness between humans and their kin, and it is his friends and relations that end up paying for his life of anger. He's basically become Homer in the Cartridge Family.
This gun cost me everything. My wife, my kids, everything but my precious, precious gun.
Finally, at the end of his frayed rope, he starts talking to his sole companion, the sword itself. And what is Gurthang's response? Well, what else could it be? Like him, the blade's sole motto has been live for revenge for most of the tale. So how is it that video games could impart the feeling or concept of a weapon that is an extension of the character or the player? Well, a seemingly obvious example of how games could evoke such a concept would be through the implementation of a crafting system. So I imagine the logic here would be that any game that allows you to create your own spin on a given weapon would allow you to dole out your own personal brand of violence. However, I'm not sure if such systems really achieve the effect that the aforementioned myths and stories get across. Again, we are looking for a system whereby there is a loop between the player controlling the weapon and the weapon controlling the player. The idea is that both weapon and wielder are involved in a relationship that neither has complete control of, and the only way to opt out would be to cast the sword aside. Games that have a fully customizable crafting system, or some such, put the player firmly in the driver's seat. The player gets everything they want, and there is no consequence or limitation imposed by making a particular weapon. Indeed, such systems are predicated on wish fulfillment and the idea that you get to be the author of your own experience. This is precisely the opposite of what we see happen with these myths, where the protagonist does not have control over the results of their actions. So far, I think a good example of a system that invokes a vicious relationship between the player or the character and the weapon would be that represented in the PlayStation classic Vagrant Story. While this game does have a crafting system, therein lies a single mechanic that makes all the difference. In the game, there are a variety of different kinds of creatures. Beast, human, dragon, undead, phantom, and evil are all enemy types that have various strengths and weaknesses. Whenever you deal damage to a creature, you slightly increase the damage that the weapon will deal to that enemy type in the future.
The upshot of all this is that after hours of play, you have created a weapon that is designed to kill a certain creature type. However, this is brought about by the player's actions and not their whim or decree. When you come up against a powerful undead, it doesn't matter how strong other weapons might be, the weapon that you have trained to kill undead will likely be the best to combat it. The player is held responsible for the past actions that they have made in combat, and while the weapons can be reforged and upgraded, the core of the experience remains the same. The only problem with Vagrant's story is that it didn't really combine this amazing system with its brilliant narrative in any meaningful way. There was a causal relationship between Ashley Riot gaining spells upon recovering lost memories, but the weapon system wasn't employed to express any themes or concepts. The main example of such a weapon in our game is not that of Lewin, a being with its own independent personality, but that of Eidos herself. Eidos is the apparatus through which the player can interact with the world of Conscientia, and in this sense, she is a tool. However, Eidos' ability to affect the world is entirely decided by the player's choices of where they go and what they do. It is demonstrated in the dialogue system where a tyrannical statement cannot be followed up by a statement of intellectual curiosity. At this point, the player has chosen to present Eidos as a forceful instrument of will, a person not interested in absorbing new information. Such choices will ultimately affect the manner of abilities that she will gain access to, and access to these new abilities will remove other options. A good example of this would be the following scenario. The player has presented themselves in the world in such a way so that they have manifested a means to do violence, whether this be through techne or possessing the Lewin blade. Now, when encountering a strange or ambiguous situation, the player will have the option of combat. However, they will no longer be capable of retreat. Eidos has been shaped into an active force. While resolution of situations through dialogue or nonviolent techne may still be possible, inaction is a choice Eidos is no longer capable of making.